On a rainy Thursday evening, the 26th of November 1963, one young man stood outside the Regal Cinema in Cambridge. He was 19 years old, 6 weeks into his studies at the university, and about to interview the most famous band in Britain. Inside the Regal, 4 young men from Liverpool were about to perform a sellout concert. The difference between them and him was huge. The 4 were superstars. They had stormed to the top of the charts with their first single, Love Me Do, and then with their first album, Please Please Me. The one, me, was a nobody, but a very cocky nobody. That morning, the editor of Varsity, the university's student newspaper, had assigned me, the paper's rookie reporter, to attend and review the concert. But then came the bombshell, the real assignment. 3 minutes backstage with John, Paul, George and Ringo in the interval. No other reporters present. 3 minutes only, but not a single second longer. Not wishing to be overawed, I armed myself with a few hastily gathered facts. I planned to give the so-called Fab Four a proper grilling. First though, the concert. A PR person ushered me to the back of the packed auditorium, where 2,000 teenagers, screaming even before the Beatles arrived on stage, made thinking impossible. In truth, I wasn't even much of a Beatles fan. My taste in music aligned more with 3 other Bs, namely Bach, Beethoven and Brahms, though I'd happily join in with twist and shout at student parties when the mood and the girls were right. But soon after the first half of the concert started, I witnessed the hysteria the band created, girls weeping and sobbing while Paul and John hollered into a shared microphone. George stood alone, aloof, and Ringo's arms swung up and down like those of a clockwork doll. When the first half ended, none too soon for me, and with collective hysteria shaking the building, the 4 Beatles ran full speed off stage. The PR person grabbed my arm. "This way," he said. My 3 minutes with the Beatles was soon to begin. Local journalists had queued up outside the dressing room. There were grumbles as I was led to the front. "He's only a student," said the PR man, "and he's only got 3 minutes, and you've all got 5 minutes each." The grumbles subsided, but only a bit. PR knocked. "Enter, at your peril!" shouted a Liverpudlian voice that could have been John, Paul, George or Ringo. The harassed man pulled a face at me and gingerly opened the door. I edged in behind him, pulling out my compact notebook and a pencil stub. The Fab Four, all puffing on cigarettes and clutching wine glasses, sat perched like parrots on cane chairs lined up in a row. As there was nowhere for me to sit, I had to stand with my back to the door. "So, who's this very fine figure of a young man?" said John Lennon, pretending to screw up his eyes as he peered at me intensely, while drawing heavily on his fag. "From the university student newspaper," said PR. "He's only got 3 minutes." "Ringo, stopwatch," said Paul McCartney. "Never owned one," said Ringo Starr. "Do a countdown then," said George Harrison. 180 seconds. "Ooh, isn't George clever?" said John. "He does maths." "But isn't it him who's supposed to be clever?" said Paul, pointing at me. "Him being a student." They all fixed their eyes on me, a specimen. "But he's not a student, is he?" said John. "He's an undergraduate. Undergrad U 8. That's what they call them at Cambridge." "Cambridge? I thought it was Oxford," said Paul. My 3-minute interview wasn't heading in exactly the direction I'd intended. "What should we call you then?" said George. "Student or undergraduate?" "Come on, boys, behave," said PR. "He's only got a short time." "Ringo," said John, lighting a fresh fag with the first. "How much longer?" "Dunno," said Ringo. "I stopped counting." "Start again," said John. Ringo, looking up at the ceiling, obeyed. 121, 120. George raised a finger. "That's 2 minutes." Paul slapped his forehead. "George is pure genius," he said. "Boys," said PR, "let him ask his questions." The 4 Beatles suddenly straightened themselves up and stared at me unflinchingly. "Right, Mr. Undergraduate," said John. "Ask your questions." But be quick, said Paul. Ringo? 61, 60s, 59. Less than a minute, said George. Only time for one question then, said John. They continued to stare at me, Ringo still counting. So I went straight for what I thought was my sharpest. What I'd like to ask is... Yes, said John leaning forward. What is it exactly you'd like to ask? Undeterred, I ploughed on. You've made 2 albums so far, but in both you included 8 original songs and 6 covers. How soon will you be making an album that's all original? John whistled and looked at Paul. Paul looked at George. George looked at Ringo. 31, 30, 29. That's a hard one, Mr. Undergraduate, said John. Paul, what's the answer? When George writes more songs, said Paul. Yes, I blurted out. George only wrote 1 song for With the Beatles and none for Please Please Me, correct? George turned to Ringo. Ringo? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's your 3 minutes up, said John. Sorry. Get what you need, asked Paul. I'm sure he did, said John. Goodbye, said Ringo. I looked at the PR man appealingly. I'm afraid that's it, he said. The Beatles had already turned away, lighting fresh cigarettes, refilling glasses. I followed the PR person out, but stopped, then turned in the doorway. Do you spell it, B-E-A-T or B-E-E-T, like insects? Oh, isn't he clever, said Paul. That's his Cambridge education, said John. Well over time, said Ringo. Next, shouted George. A Cambridge Daily News reporter slid in, once I'd stepped into the corridor. Wish you better luck than I had, I muttered as the door shut on him. The editor of Varsity didn't care much for my draft article about the, interview. He spiked it and told me to write a short news item instead. Which I did. A good deal less cocky than when I'd arrived outside the Regal Cinema in Cambridge that rainy Thursday evening on the 26th of November 1963, and the Beatles met me.